And this is really the point where I experienced my scariest moment, even scary before we landed in the river, because the water in a matter of seconds went from my ankles to above my chest. And it was 35-degree water, and it was 22 degrees outside. So the cold is just something I can't really adequately, it was like needles in my entire body.
Have you ever heard the phrase becoming the best version of yourself? Yeah, me too. But what does that even mean, and how do we become that person? I'm here to help you navigate through those questions and come up with actionable steps in order for you to live your best life. We've got to discover what we want. We've got to figure out a plan on how to get there, and then we have to go. We can't just sit and wait any longer. Life won't wait on us. So come join me on this constant journey to become the best version of yourself and to find your best you. I'll see you on the other side. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Nick Carrier's Best You podcast. Today, we've got a super inspiring lady today with me, Vallie Collins. I appreciate you joining me today, Vallie.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So Vallie was a passenger on Flight 1549, which on January 15, 2009, went down in the Hudson River, which you guys probably know from the movie Sully. So we're going to get I'm just so excited to dive deep into that story. Already seen some good stuff that you've talked about in the past, and just excited to dive even deeper into that. But let's go ahead and jump right into it, Vallie. I want to get right into the story. Basically, when was the first moment that you guys knew something was wrong?
About 90 seconds after takeoff, between 90 seconds and 2 minutes at an altitude of almost 3,000 feet, not quite 3,000 feet, we heard this boom, and the plane dropped, not a little bit, but not a lot, but just a little bit. But that was the point where I knew, okay, something's not right here.
Okay. Did you think like that it was at all like severe? Like, did you think like, oh my gosh, like I'm actually in great danger? Or was it just like, I've never heard that before. Like hopefully it's nothing.
Well, when I heard that noise, I was sitting on an aisle seat on the last row of the airplane, and there was no one in the middle seat, a gentleman at the window. And I just looked at him and said, what was that? And he had been looking out the window, and he said it was birds. And so I was kind of like, okay. And I know that bird strikes happen. A lot of times they'll take out one engine, you fly back, land, no problem. But about that time, to my left, he was sitting to my right. To my left, I see smoke, and I smell this really awful, awful odor. And years ago, I had a pilot tell me on a flight that was very turbulent. He knew I was nervous. He leaned over. But years ago, I had a pilot tell me, don't worry about turbulence. Up front in the cockpit, all we worry about are birds and fire. So I thought, great, we've got both birds and fire. So at this point, I knew, okay, this is not a good situation. And also by this point, let's say another 15 seconds have gone by. And I fly a lot. I'm a frequent flyer. I travel a lot. And at that point, I realized, we're not climbing, and I don't hear any engine noise. And, usually in the first 4 or 5 minutes of a flight, it's full engines, you're climbing, you're going up, your altitude's increasing, and that wasn't happening. So pretty quick, I was aware that this was a dire situation.
Okay. And so did a lot of people have that awareness, and like, was there a lot of like frantic conversation going back and forth?
No, not really. I think a lot of it depended on where you were sitting on the aircraft. Since I was in the last row, I was behind the engines. So it was real clear to me when the engines were no longer running, let's say, versus someone who's sitting up on the first row, who's a fair distance away from those engines. So in talking to the passengers over a year, I think we all had various levels of awareness and consciousness about what was going on. I mean, some people had fallen asleep before takeoff, like you do on flights, and were just oblivious at first. So it kind of depended on where you were on the plane and just how in tune you are. Some people had headphones on or reading their book, and there was not at that moment, there was not a sense of panic or pandemonium. It was actually eerily quiet, because I think a lot of people that were noticing, like, well, this is weird. That's not normal, kind of looking around. But it wasn't as if we were falling from the sky in a nosedive and everyone was screaming. It wasn't that type of sensation.
Okay. And so what period of time was the gap between kind of like this 90 seconds to 2 minute period to when the captain came on over the intercom?
Okay, well, from the time the birds hit to the time we hit the river was 3.5 minutes.
Right.
Schellenberger came on the PA system about 90 seconds before we hit the river. So probably from that first hit to when he came on was about 2 minutes. And all he said was, "This is the captain, brace for impact."
This whole thing just happened so fast. I can't even like imagine. You don't even necessarily like have the time to know what's going through your head. It's just like so crazy.
No, well, I'll disagree with you there.
Okay.
Actually, 3.5 minutes is a long time. You sit and look at your watch for 3.5 minutes and you think, "I'm dying. This is it." It's not like a car wreck that hits you out of the blue and you don't know what happened. 3.5 minutes is a commercial break. You can go to the bathroom, pop a bag of popcorn. So when people say it just happened so fast, it really didn't. I would say set your watch on 3.5 minutes and try to look somebody in the face eye to eye for 3.5 minutes. It's a long time when you think it's your last 3.5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So was the moment that he came on the intercom like finally when everybody was like, oh crap, something's
Right.
actually going on. Okay. And so what was it? What was it like then? Was then everybody like, was it constant conversation? Were anybody moving around? Was everybody just kind of strapped in and silent? Like what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's in their seats because we were in takeoff. When you take
Yeah.
off, everybody's in their seat belts. Nobody's computers are out. Bags are put away. And I think that's one of the reasons we had so few injuries is because everyone was seated and they had their seat belts on. At that point, the flight attendants, both in the front and the back, start chanting, brace, brace, heads down, brace, brace, heads down. And that's when if you've ever looked at a safety card, which I'd encourage everyone to do, in your mind, it's like, okay, time to bend over and put my arms underneath my thighs and fold into a sandwich like it shows you on the card.
Wow.
And, I looked across the aisle. There were 3 ladies across the aisle from me. And I remember looking over at them and just a lot of praying going on. No sound was coming out. You could see their mouths moving. But from where I was sitting at that point, you still didn't hear a lot of panic or pandemonium or anything. I think people were just trying to get focused on bracing. And when a captain says brace for impact, okay, what kind of impact? Like, what is this impact going to be? And just how bad is it going to be? And so the gentleman sitting next to me who had been looking out the window was still looking out the window. He told me, he said, "Be ready, we're going in the water." So he was looking out and could tell that they had lined the plane up with what was the Hudson River. I don't know. None of us knew that was the Hudson River. It was just this body of water.
Right. Right. So you talked about how it was a long 3.5 minutes. So what was going through your head? Is it just like a race of different things? Is it like what's going to happen when we land? Or is it like, I'm definitely going to die, so these other thoughts are going in my head? What's exactly happening in those 3.5 minutes up here?
There's a couple of things going on. The first was my thought. I travel a lot, and so did my husband, and we didn't keep up with details like what airline, what flight number, what connection city. So my first thought was very pragmatic in that Steve doesn't know I'm on this plane. It could take him a day, a week, a long, hours, who knows how to get confirmation that, yes, she was on board. So I looked down at my feet and my purse was underneath the seat with my BlackBerry telephone sticking out. So I pulled it out. I sent Steve a text message that just said, "My flight is crashing," period. Now, I joke and said, had perfect punctuation and spelling, but I wanted him to know, yeah, I'm on board this. He's going to hear about it. If it doesn't end well, I didn't want him to have questions of, did she make it on that plane? Is she stuck in traffic somewhere? I wanted him to, and that was all that I could get typed out because my seatmate, he said, "Put that up, you're out of time." So I just sent that text and that's all it said.
I'm just speechless. Oh my gosh.
He was too when he got, so that's the one thought. The first thought was, okay, I've got a task here. I've got to let him know. And then it was sadness. I was 37 years old. My children were 9, 6, and 4. They had so much life ahead of them. So I was very sad for all the things I was going to miss. I'm not going to be there for high school graduation or weddings or hitting a home run, and who's going to plan their birthday parties. And so all I could think about selfishly was all this great part of their lives I'm going to miss. Now, there were other passengers on board that said literally they did that rewind on their life. They started thinking back, like you hear people say, their life flashed before their eyes. A lot of people had that experience, but I had more of a sadness, then coupled with I'm a person of faith. I knew where I was headed. So there was a certain peace that came with that. I remember thinking to myself, well, this is your will, God, I accept it. I'm still not crazy about it, but I accept it. At that stage in my life, really the only close person, family member that had ever died was one of my grandparents. My other 3 grandparents were alive. My parents were alive, my sister, and I just remember thinking, well, he'll be there waiting on me, So those were kind of three sets of feelings that were going through my mind in those moments. And then when my seatmate said we're going in the water, then I kind of clicked back to that practical, okay, airplane water landing, most likely what's going to happen is this plane's going to cartwheel and it's going to bust into a lot of pieces. So what I said to myself was, okay, if you're conscious, just swim to the light. Just try to swim to the light if you're conscious when we hit. And that was my plan.
I'm just like, just sitting here to say, I'm like, my body's like trembling thinking about it.
Yeah, it was crazy. Quite a ride.
So did your husband get the text right away? Like when you, right when you sent it, or did he, I guess he knew right away?
Well, not exactly. So the way that played out is when I boarded the airplane, I was talking to my little sister on the phone, and she had asked me when I was getting home, and I'd said, I'm going through Charlotte. I'll be home at 7. So that kind of going through Charlotte resonated with her. Well, when I sent Steve the text message, oddly enough, Steve was swimming at the gym, so he didn't have his phone with him. When my sister's at home and she sees this come on the news, and it doesn't even say en route to Charlotte yet, but she just innately knew I was on board. She just said, I knew my sister was on that. I could just feel it. And then when it said en route to Charlotte, she was even more convinced. So she calls Steve and leaves him a voicemail saying, what's Vallie's flight number? I think she's on this plane that's crashed. So when he comes out of the gym, gets in the car, starts, he's in sales, starts checking his voicemails, and he hears her voicemail. So he goes back into the gym where the treadmills are. And of course, at this point, it's on every TV. And so he's looking at all the TVs, trying to process Shay's voicemail, and then the phone vibrates with my text that said my flight's crashing. So that's when he knew for sure that I was on board. They still weren't talking survivors or number of survivors yet. Meantime, my sister has called my parents, who works together, and told them her suspicion. Steve ends up calling my dad and confirming to him. So long story short, the 4 of them had about half an hour of knowing I was on board, but not knowing if I survived. So they had their own kind of level of trauma.
Right. Did, what is your husband, what does he say that he was like thinking? Like when he gets this information, all of a sudden it's just like, it hits him like a ton of bricks, right? I mean, like all of a sudden he's swimming, all of a sudden he gets this rush of information that's just frantic that says, my plane is crashing. He sees it on this TV. Like what's going through his head?
Well, he went into true, operation mode, so to speak, true dad mode. Our children were at home with the babysitter. So he called her immediately and said, do not turn on the TV. Do not answer the phone. Do not let the kids get on the computer, because I think Vallie's been in a plane crash. And if she's not coming home, I have to tell them. Like they have to hear it from me. They can't hear it from anybody else but me. So he put them in lockdown. Basically, that was his first, his first reaction was, I got to take care of my children. Could be really bad. I got to set my children up as well as I can in this horrible situation. So that was his immediate response. And then he's driving home. He's, of course, trying to talk to my sister, talking to my parents. Well, then my company that I'm working for calls because the travel agency gets like a alert or whatever that they had booked a customer on this flight that's now reported, having landed in the river. So my company's calling Steve saying, I think, and he's like, I know. He's trying to get off the phone in the event that I might call. So that's what he did.
Oh my gosh. All right. So let's go back to the incident. The plane hits the water,
Mm-hmm.
and then what? Like well, let's start with what is exactly do you feel? Is it just like, I mean, yeah, just start. What does it feel like?
We hit the water at 160 miles an hour, which would be
That's
like
it?
landing on concrete at 160 miles an hour, no wheels. So it was very rough and it was very violent. And my memory is that it just shook a lot. It was like somebody shaking your shoulders. But for what I had myself prepared for, when it hit and we seemingly stopped and I'm in one piece and the plane's in one piece, literally my first thought was, well, that wasn't that bad, because I was prepared for us to cartwheel and water come rushing in. And, I mean, it was rough. I'm not going to say it was like a smooth, but compared to what it could have been and what I had myself mentally prepared for, it wasn't that terrible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you were expecting, like you said, to cartwheel and for it just kind of to explode and like maybe
Right.
just swim towards the light.
Right.
So you're just expecting worst case scenario. So how quickly after the landing are everybody just like immediately able to start to move and try to get out, or what's the gap time there?
Okay, yeah, pretty much. What's funny, I'll tell a little joke on myself, or a funny and embarrassing moment. When we hit and we seemingly stopped, I popped my head up and I looked at my seatmate and I told him, I said, open that window. Of course, airplane windows don't open, and he's kind of like, was there a button here? There's no way to do. But my immediate thought was, I got to get out of here.
Right.
And I'm not going to fit through an airplane window either. But, you kind of lose. So that point, I'm sitting on the last row of the plane. So 100%, my closest exit is behind me.
Okay.
So I go to the galley, and I'm the first passenger back there. At this point, other passengers getting up. But when I get to the rear galley, the flight attendant is trying to crack open the left rear door. And I went even over trying to help her. I mean, it says exit, and you want out. Well, we're not going to get that door open because the water pressure outside is a lot stronger than we are. Then she says, we're in the water. And she said, you have 2 minutes, go to the wings. And she started moving towards the wings. More passengers came into the rear galley and they tried to get the right rear door open. It wouldn't open either. And this is really the point where I experienced my scariest moment, even scarier before we landed in the river, because the water in a matter of seconds went from my ankles to above my chest. And it was 35-degree water and it was 22 degrees outside. So the cold is just something I can't really adequately. It was like needles in my entire body. And I'm standing in an airplane galley. It's not very big. And I just thought, Lord, I do not want to drown. I mean, I really thought I was going to drown. And people at this point in the back of the plane are like me thinking, well, the closest exit is the back. So they're trying to come to the back. Well, we're not getting out the back. I'm 100% sure of that. I mean, the back is sinking. So that's when I just put up my arms and started saying, go to the wings, just to turn people around. But, the atmosphere in the plane at this point was pretty chaotic. I get the question a lot, what do I think of the movie Sully? I think it's a great movie. I think they do a great job, except the evacuation scene in the movie was a lot more orderly than it was in real life. In real life, people were crying, screaming, climbing over seats. Some people were trying to get their luggage out of the overhead. It was just, you just kind of, and you just, a lot of people were just disconnected with what is the reality. Like, okay, it's time to get off. Let me get my suitcase. That's what I always do. But it was pretty chaotic at that point.
Okay, so you're at the scariest moment with the freezing water, like rising up really quickly, and then you guys start moving towards the wings.
Right.
How soon then do you go from scariest moment to be like, I might actually live?
Yeah, by the time, okay, so I was seated on row 26.
Mm-hmm.
The over the wing exits rows 10 and 11. So probably around row 15 or 16, I could see the light of day. I could see people moving out of those exit doors. So time-wise, I can't really tell you exactly, maybe a minute and a half, But when I stepped out onto the wing, I came out on the right wing. And I'm not one of the people you see way out on the wing because I was one of the last passengers out. So I'm really close to the fuselage of the plane. But when I stepped out on that wing, I thought, okay, I'm not dying. I'm not going to die today. I could see ferry boats approaching. That was the first point where I felt like I had some control of my destiny. When you're sitting in that airplane seat and somebody else up front is flying and you have no control. And that's what's scary for all of us as humans is lack of control. And when I was in the galley with the water rushing in, if these people don't move forward, we're going to drown back here. So when I made it out of the wing, this is an incorrect statement, but when I made it to the wing, I looked left and I looked right and I thought, well, if I have to, I'll swim to that shore. Michael Phelps could not have swam to that shore in that temperature water, but at least in my mind, I thought, okay, I've got a little control over my situation.
Gosh. Yeah, you'd probably dive. You'd probably freeze to death before you could.
Yeah, I think they say cardiac arrest would set in 15 minutes in that kind of water. So you're not gonna make it very long.
Yeah, but like you said, if you the rationale was there, you also thought you could get out a plane window. So
right. You lose some connection there with reality.
Yeah. Okay. So when you guys got off the plane that day, like what do you do the rest of the day after something like that?
Okay, so when we finally got off the plane, I got out onto a ferry boat, that took me to Weehawken, New Jersey, ferry terminal. And we were there for about 2 hours because they had to start processing us. They huddled us up in this one little room. They gave us blankets. They put these body tags on us, like these triage tags to kind of assess what level. I mean, they're the same kind of tags that they would put on a corpse. There's different levels. So that was a little surreal, but they all had a barcode. So they were trying to get a name associated with the barcode because the airlines overall, because many of us went to New Jersey and many of us went to New York and different places in New York. So, the 155 were scattered. So the main thing, especially Sully, he wanted to know who, is everyone accounted for? Because at that point, we still didn't know if everyone had survived. They had sent divers into the airplane, and the divers couldn't believe that there were no bodies there. So it took about 2 hours that I was at that ferry terminal. You've got ambulances coming, first responders coming. Those of us that were in wet clothes had to get out of the wet clothes. So Shelby, was kind of funny. I was given a men's New York Waterways uniform, which was size 48 Dickie pants and a triple XL sweater. Huge. But it was dry and it was warm. And then they had to kind of assess of those of us that were there who needed to go to a hospital and who didn't. Who was okay to go to like a Red Cross shelter and who needed to go to a hospital. And you've got to remember, I left everything on board the plane. So I had nothing, no phone, no ID, no money. It was when I look back on those moments sitting in the ferry terminal on like a bar stool type stool wrapped up, there are all these people I knew were there to help. You've got police, Port Authority, firemen, residents from a local, from University of Hoboken are coming to help. It's kind of all hands on deck, but it was the most alone feeling. Even though I knew the people were there to help, I didn't know where I was going to spend the night, how I was going to get home. No money, no ID, no phone. It's just this kind of it was an odd situation, but we saw the best of humanity that day. Literally the ferry boat captain, when I was on his boat, my sweater was so wet and I was so cold, I took it off because I thought I'd be warmer. And he gave me the shirt off his back. I had a Port Authority worker who I had to get out of all my clothes and bag them up. He made sure my clothes made it to the hospital. So I was in Weehawken. This was a very long answer to your question, I realized, but I was there about 2 hours, and then I was taken to the University of Hoboken Medical Center, and I was processed there for a while because 2 hours after we came out of the water, my body temperature was still only about 92. So the hypothermia risk was there. Well, probably about 10 o'clock that night. We landed in the river at 3:30, in the afternoon. Probably about 10 o'clock that night. My good luck continued because Steve's first cousin lives 5 blocks from that hospital. So she came and got me, and I spent the night with them.
So what was the first point that you actually got to talk to your husband and kids again?
Yeah, well, when I got on the ferry boat, when I climbed up off the raft onto the ferry boat, I borrowed a man's phone because I remembered that I had sent Steve this text message, so he's got to be freaking out. So I just borrowed the man's phone and called Steve, and I said, honey, it's me. I'm okay. And you know what he said?
What?
He said, call your mother. My mother was hysterical. So I called my mother, and I don't know what she said to me, but she said when she heard me say I'm wet and I'm cold, she said, I knew you knew enough, you'd be okay. So that's when and then later, I guess, can't remember, when I got to the hospital, it was a lot of coordination because Steve's cousin lives in New Jersey, but I had no phone. At one point, they said they were going to send me to one hospital, and then they sent me to another one. So between Steve, his dad, his cousin, they're trying to triangulate where I'm actually going and when she could potentially come and get me. And, I probably talked to him again from the hospital, but I don't really remember. I mean, reporters were calling the ER. I mean, it was crazy how fast the news media was all over everything. But I got to their house probably 10 or so that night. And that's when I called Steve and we kind of developed a plan for the next day because I knew I would fly again, but I knew I wasn't flying home. So at this point, U.S. Airways had booked him a ticket up to New Jersey for the following morning. He was going to come get me and drive me home. So we started talking about those logistics later that night, probably 10, 11 o'clock.
This is nuts. This is unbelievable. So after this happens, you've been interviewed a number of times, probably like right after it, and ever since, and you speak a lot, and people ask you a ton of questions about the event, and you're probably sick and tired of hearing a lot of them. But is there any question that you wish people asked you more about the particular event that you don't get asked very often?
That's a good question. Is there a question I wish they asked me more?
Maybe about maybe about what was going through your head,
I think the question that because you go through something like this and you want to learn from it and you hope that someone else learns from it. And one of the learnings I talk about is just empathy for people that have mental issues. So I think people asking more and better understanding about the mental impact of that type of traumatic experience, that type of life and death moment, that type of adrenaline rush, it affects you. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's a very real mental illness, and there's different levels of it. And even for the passengers on board the flight, some people suffered with it a lot worse than I did. Some people didn't have as hard a time as I did. Kind of depended on where you were on the plane, what your level was of awareness, how soon, et cetera. So I think I try to take the stigma away from that because there's a lot of people that suffer from that for all different reasons, whether it's our veterans who have gone through extended type trauma or somebody that's been in an experience like mine, or maybe somebody that's just come in and their home's been broken into and there's a sense of, violation, that you feel violated in your own home and you don't trust. So I think that's probably the thing that, initially people would come up to us, the passengers, and say things like, you were on that flight. How cool was that? Well, the ending was cool, but the experience was not cool. But we had to realize we were sort of the good news story of the year. I mean, this is early 2009. Our country is in one of the worst economic crises it's been in a long time. It's kind of bad news everywhere. We were, in New York, who had seen such terrible tragedy in 2001, to have this miracle kind of happen, because it was pretty miraculous that we all survived. And so we were the good news story of the year. So people are so excited, and you wanted to be excited, and I was excited to be alive, and I was very grateful, but I was still dealing with a lot of emotional trauma, hurt, and that's nobody's fault. But I'm just saying, I think if that's probably the question I would best like is, how did it affect you long term? And it will always affect me. I mean, I don't think PTSD time helps, but it's never something that's going to completely go away. Where I'll tell people, if I had broken my leg, I'd have been on crutches for 6 weeks in a cast, and that leg would healed up and been as good as new. It would have been the exact same leg as it was when I boarded the plane. But when you go through traumatic experiences, you never get that same brain back, if you will, that same perspective on life. I mean, I had to go to counseling for a while, and they even had to bring Steve in because there were parts of our relationship that were different because I was different. In some ways, I think I'm better. In some ways, I was worse than the lady that boarded that flight. But what everyone had to come to understand, including me, was that woman that boarded the flight was not going to ever be the same. You're going to be changed when you go through something like that.
Right. So what advice can you give to people who go through that kind of a traumatic event? Like, and what advice would you give to yourself, like right afterwards, having known and gone through what you've gone through now?
I think the advice I would give is number one, and this is pretty textbook. I didn't realize it at the time, but traumatic PTSD, the symptoms of that don't show up immediately after an event. So, the next couple of days, now granted, I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't eat. I lost a fair amount of weight. Maybe that's the adrenaline rush. But, a couple of days later, I thought, I'm fine. I'm good. I'll go back to work next week. Everything. Then like 3 weeks in, all of a sudden, I just wasn't myself. Like I couldn't put my finger on it. And it's not like I had a broken leg or I was running a fever or, there wasn't an assignable, but I just didn't feel like me. I should be so happy to be alive, but yet I felt so sad all the time. So the advice I would say is I had a great network of people around me that I could confide in. And one of those was my father-in-law. And we went to lunch and he's the one that said, maybe you need to go talk to somebody. So I think my advice to people is when you're struggling with something mentally, there's no shame in going to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. If you think you have cancer, there's no shame in going to the doctor to get that treated. But there's this stigma in our country about mental health issues. And, I had never been a person that needed that kind of help before. But I think just it's okay to go get some help. And it was nice to a lot of the thoughts and things that were going around in my head. Steve would have listened to me all day long. My family would have listened to me. But there's value in being able to just, for lack of a better term, throw those feelings up on an independent third-party person. That's, at some point is not going to be a part of your life, and they're not going to go tell anybody else, and you can just get that out on them, get some counsel from them to help you move through. So that's the one. And another thing I think is, if you don't get that help, if you think, oh, I got this, I can muscle through, pull myself, that trauma is going to come back around and bite you at some point. It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, but you've got to address that stuff, when it occurs.
Yeah. So why do you think that you were like so sad? Like, obviously the event itself was nuts and it's crazy, and like you have all the reasons to be super just kind of distraught. But do you think that, like, you mentioned how I should be super happy, I should be grateful to be alive and all these things, but I wasn't. Do you think like that idea in and of itself is what was like maybe keeping you down or what keeping you sad, or like really what was it, do you think, that it took for you to start getting out of?
Well, I think it's a compilation of things. I mean, some of it I think is just straight brain chemistry that happens when you go through an adrenaline, fight or flight type thing. And again, that adrenaline rush, 3.5 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but it is a long time in that, especially with no control. Even soldiers in combat have a gun, so they feel like they have a sense of control. But in our situation, we had none. So I think part of it is just the physiological piece of it. I think the other part of it of why, I heard a great analogy one time. And they said a tightrope walker is able to do what they do because they never look down. The tightrope walker never considers the other option of falling. They only consider making it to the other side. Well, for us, we were in a moment we looked down. So we became very clear on what the other option was. I tell people, we all know we're going to die, right? Nobody's getting out of this gig alive. Nobody thinks it's going to be today. And when you think it's today, that alters you. And so when it's not today, you think it's going to be today, it's not today. All your subsequent days, you keep looking for danger in everything. You don't trust that you're going to have tomorrow.
Wow.
Because you sat in a moment where you didn't think you would have tomorrow. So for a while, I didn't even want to put anything on my calendar. Why schedule a vacation? I probably won't live that long, So again, I know it sounds really crazy, but that's part of what the sadness is, that you lost the trust that you're going to have tomorrow, because you really, honestly, truly believed I would not have tomorrow. So that took a long time to process. And like I said, for PTSD and most things, time is the best healer. It does, time goes on. And that I could be driving down the interstate and 18-wheeler goes, that 18-wheeler is going to come over my lane and hit my car and kill me. Those are kind of thoughts you have, which that could happen, but the likelihood of that happening, and that's the thing, but what happened in our plane was so unlikely. It was a 1 in 8 billion chance, billion with a B, that birds would knock out both engines of a jet liner. Like, it just made no sense. And, and it's funny with PTSD too, something I'd like people to understand is you can have those symptoms come back with something not related at all to a plane. Mm-hmm. Like when the horrible, the school shootings up was it in Connecticut? No, all those young children. Well, that kind of threw me back into that because those parents were doing something they deemed safe. They were taking their kids to school. We were just getting on a flight home. And all of a sudden it wasn't safe. So in my brain, it pops up like, ooh, this should be safe, but it's probably not. You can't trust things that are supposed to be safe. Again, I know that sounds crazy, but that's the part that I think people, need to understand. And that's what I tell people is just none of us are going to need to be experts on every aspect of mental health and mental issues. But I think just recognize that somebody may look just fine on the outside, but you don't know what they're wrestling with on the inside. And just give them a little extra empathy, especially for something you maybe don't personally understand.
Right. So when you get thrown back into that, like the PTSD from an event that, especially from an event that has kind of nothing to do with a plane or anything like that.
Yeah.
What do you start to do to help yourself kind of get out of that moment of thought?
Mode, yeah, because even things like chaos, something's chaotic and out of my control. I mean, my son one time had a slumber party with a bunch of 10-year-old boys, and I felt myself about to come unglued, and I realized it because it was so chaotic and I could not control it. And as silly as it sounds, deep breathing helps a lot. Literally 10 slow breaths in, 10 slow breaths out, because physiologically that will bring your heart rate down. A panic attack is your heart rate, accelerating up too high and getting out. Well, so when I get in those moments, I, try to redirect my brain in one aspect, but the second is literally just try to slow my breathing down to physically calm myself down.
Gotcha. So what do you do differently now, maybe on like a daily basis, that you wouldn't have done that way if the accident had never happened? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm human. I slip, I mess up, but I really try not to sweat the small stuff. There are so many little things in life that we tend to get our blood pressure up over, whether it's somebody cutting us off on the on-ramp on the highway or, my dog chewing up my favorite pair of shoes, my son not making up his bed. I mean, just little things that tend to get under our skin I really try not to let those things bother me. And when I start to let it bother me, I'm like, you know what, Vallie, in the grand scheme of life, that's not that big of a deal. There are really few things that we encounter that are worth raising our blood pressure up over. And I just recognize, I mentally acknowledge every day how thankful I am for that day. I mean, every day is a lucky day.
Yeah. So you just have a lot more like clarity and perspective.
Perspective. That is for sure perspective. I definitely, I don't leave my relationships with my friends and my family. They all know I love them. Even if we get sideways on something, I'm going to work it out. I'm not going to leave anything unsaid or undone or let something fester. Even if it's a relationship, you decide, you know what, it's time for us to part ways. Let's just agree to disagree and, maybe we don't run in the same circles. And that happens in life. You have friends and people in your life for seasons, and sometimes those seasons end. But rather than letting something harbor negatively, I don't do that anymore.
Right.
Not that I did a lot of that before, but I just try to make sure all my relationships are as healthy as they can be.
Right. So those are a couple of definitely great lessons that you learned from it. You do like we talked about a lot of speaking engagements now, and of course you share your story and go through everything that a lot of what we discussed. But what are the lessons and the messages that you wish to communicate with others? Things like that, like have a little bit of perspective. Don't let relationships stay in a negative spot. Like, what are some of those messages that you try to communicate with others?
Yeah, I tell people there's 5 key ones. One is just about being kind. Just be kind to other people. After it was all over, I remember thinking, Did the bus driver from the terminal from the rental car lot to the terminal, would he have thought of me as a kind person? Did I smile at the gate agent? Was I friendly to my seatmate? So, as we walk through our day-to-day life, we don't know who the other person is. We'll have that very last interaction. It might be Steve that I kiss goodnight, but it may be a drive-through worker at Chick-fil-A that hands me a Diet Coke. So simply just being kind. That's where my Ralph Waldo Emerson quote comes in. He says, "You can never do a kindness too soon, for you never know how soon it may be too late." Mm-hmm. Empathy is the other one. Empathy is the other learning, which I've already talked about from a mental health standpoint. The third one is staying physically fit to the best of your ability, because you may be in a situation where physically you've got to be able to save your own life or help out a friend or family member or help out a stranger. The fourth one.
Sorry to stop you. I don't even think like I've ever thought about physical fitness in the sense of like life or death, when like obviously like back in the day, that's all it was. But I think that's if you can't motivate yourself to be physically fit just to be physically fit, then like that's another great way to get motivated.
Yeah, because when we were sitting on the raft, to get up on the deck of the ferry boat was probably 12 to 15 feet above our heads, and it was like a grid, like a rubber grid. It wasn't even a ladder. And a lot of passengers just physically struggled being able to climb out, and I was able to help a little girl get up. So just being, physically where you can get out an exit door of an airplane. So that's practical perspective. We've already talked about not sweating the small stuff and making those relationships. And then the last one is just time, taking time to live a little bit every day. Whatever that means to you. If it's going on a run, for me, playing a tennis match, even if I lose, that was my living moment for that day. Reading a book, throwing balls with your child in the yard, watching the game. I tell people, nobody on our plane in that 3.5 minutes was worried about how many unanswered emails we had, how much money was in our checking account, whether our yards were mowed. We were worried about that time we were going to miss with the people that we love. So just take time to live somehow a little bit every day, and just, mentally acknowledge it. Like, okay, here's my living moment for today.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So obviously your life changed in so many different ways after this event, but your career changed too, right? So, basically, so you're going to do a bunch of speaking engagements. So tell me a little bit about like how life has changed career-wise, like because you probably never thought you were going to be doing what you do now prior to this. So just tell me a little bit about like what that's been like for you.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I was my training college, I was a biomedical engineer. I worked in manufacturing for 7 years. I worked in sales for 13. That's what I was doing on this trip, just a sales call in that industry. After this happened and I got diagnosed with PTSD, I took 3 months off. And then I went back part-time for about 3 years. And, I got asked to speak the summer after the crash once, and it wasn't something I set out to do, but I spoke once and somebody told somebody and somebody told somebody else. And it's just sort of snowballed into this little mini career. And it's been great. And it's the perfect situation for me, because if I never speak again, that's fine too. But if people, hear me and want to hear the story, and I think people, even though it's been 10 years, people can identify with being a passenger on a plane. Most of us have been on an airplane and we've wondered, it might be a little harder to identify with being Sully, the guy flying the plane, but most people can just identify with being a mom on a business trip, and people like to hear stories that they can identify with. So it is just this. It's been a real blessing, because I've met wonderful people, gone to a lot of great places. And my takeaway is, if there's one person in one of my audiences that takes something away and does something better with their life, maybe that's why I was a passenger on that plane. I'll never know, why I happened to be one of the 155.
Wow. That's awesome. So I feel like I can't finish the interview without asking about Sully, Captain Sully. So tell me just a bit, like, a couple quick things about him, what you've learned from him, and just like how amazing of a guy he is. I don't know, whatever you kind of want to say about him.
Yeah, he's a great guy. He's one of those people, he has a very humble confidence about him. You meet people in your life where they just sort of command your respect without trying, without demanding it. You just respect them. And he's that guy. I mean, he's a pilot's pilot. He loves aviation. He could fly a plane before he could drive a car legally. He didn't want to be considered a hero. His view was, I just did the job I was trained to do. That was my job, and I was trained to do it, and I did it. But he's being way too humble there, because I've talked to many pilots over the years, and most of them have told me that there's about 10 guys in the world that could have pulled off what he did. But I think part of the learning from me for Sully is just his confidence. When he was interviewed by, I believe, Katie Couric, and she asked him, did you think you could do it? And he said, I knew I could do it. He knew, he had the confidence. It was a dire situation over the most densely populated city in America, arguably. And here he's got, a plane full of people with almost no airspeed, full of fuel, but he knew he could do it. So I think sometimes when life throws us the most adverse challenges, part of it is believing that you can do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like you can kind of hear that in his voice from like the real life audio, and like from the movie. It's just like, we're going to be in the Hudson. It wasn't like, it wasn't like there wasn't any kind of like quivering in his voice or any kind of like questioning about it. It's like, this is kind of what's about to happen.
And it's really funny if you listen all the way back at the very start of the air traffic control recordings. Officer Skiles was flying the plane when we took off. So he says he made Sully famous because he flew him into the birds. But with the very, very start, when Skiles is flying the takeoff, you'll hear Sully say, what a beautiful view of the Hudson today. So it was almost as if that seed was planted. He had seen that river, that seed was planted, and then, 15, 20 seconds later, he's having to decide that he's going to land that plane in that river. So it's kind of weird how things like that, when you look back, how things like that work out.
That's crazy. So you guys just had the 10-year anniversary, right? Like back in February. Was there any kind of common conversation that kept coming up amongst you guys? Or like, what was the main talking point of everybody that met together for that 10-year anniversary?
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten together as passengers. There's some groups that get together every year in New York in January, but we've gotten together for sure at the 1 year, the 3 year, the 5 year, the 10 year. And, we don't spend a lot of time talking about that day as much as passengers. We spend more time talking about all the days since. The kids that have been born, the dogs that everybody's gotten, the graduations, the weddings, the grandbabies, the new jobs, the total change in life focus or career path, travel, bucket list items. That's what we spend most of our time talking about when we're together, is everything since that day.
That's awesome. I love that. So if you had to give advice to somebody, like this person has never gone through any like traumatic event like this before, but for whatever reason, they want advice on like how to deal with a life-threatening situation. Like what advice would you give to, I'll phrase it this way to make it a little bit more understandable, I guess. What advice would you give to yourself before the flight, knowing now what you know now? Like just for the experience of the traumatic event in and of itself. Like not for the afterwards, but what advice would you give yourself about the particular
in that
event?
moment?
Yes.
Probably I would have had on more functional shoes than what I was wearing. I had on boots with a big heel. And I probably would have, rather preferred to have on running shoes or waterproof boots, maybe. A wetsuit, I would have been good. If I knew what was going to happen, I think I'd have dressed a little differently. But that's what, statistically, when people are in those situations, they say about 70% of people will stay calm and do what they need to do and not panic. About 30% will panic. And that's kind of what we saw. But what was really interesting is for the 30% that panicked or became really one of those 70%, shepherd them, carried them on out, helped them. So I happen to be, I think, in the category of a non-panicker, like I became really clear on, I got to get out of here. My little sister says God put the right sister on the plane. She said I'd have been one of the ones that lost my mind. But I think just trying to stay as calm as you can and think as clearly as you can, but different shoes for sure.
It's pretty funny. That's why you initially go to. That's funny. So before I ask the last question, Vallie, I want to acknowledge you. I think that first off, that it's cool that you were in one of the 70% who kind of be able to, relatively stay relaxed. And I think that it's cool that you were thinking about you were forward thinking about the things that you were going to be able to miss. That wasn't necessarily something that you I chose to think in the future. It's just something that came to you. And I think that's really cool. And then now how you're wanting to kind of give back and communicate the message to people who have, especially, I think giving the message to people who have gone through traumatic events that it's okay to go out and seek help. That it's something that you need to do because you never know when it's going to come back to you at other periods of your life. And I think that's awesome for you to be able to openly communicate that that's what you've gone through and that's what you struggled with. And that's how you've coped with it.
There's no shame in our struggle. One of my best moments after a talk I gave probably 5 or 6 years ago now, I had a 6'3" Marine come up to me with tears in his eyes. And he said, "Thank you for putting PTSD out there, making it a real thing that nobody needs to be ashamed of." And that's one of those what I call a little God wink, okay, keep speaking, Vallie. If he's one of my ones that hopefully I helped him.
Wow, that's so cool. That's so cool. So you have your website, valliecollins.com. So if anyone wants to book you or learn more about you, that's where they can go, right?
Yep, there's a contact page on valliecollins.com, VALLIECOLLINS. Yeah, just hit me up, send me an email, and we'll go from there.
All right, awesome. Very good. Well, I always ask the last question to everybody on the show. So the podcast, like we talked beforehand, is called the Best You Podcast. And I believe that everybody's on the constant journey of becoming the best version of yourself.
Sure.
And that I also believe it's a very unique journey. I think the way that I'm going to become the best version of myself is going to be different than the way that you become the best version of yourself. And so what I want to ask for you personally is if you could currently work on or do 3 things to get closer to that best Vallie Collins that you can be. What are those 3 things that you could currently do or 3 things you could currently work on?
I think the one thing that I could work on that I'm not very good at all is just being still, taking time to just be still a little bit every day, whether that's whatever that is for you, if it's meditating or praying or just be still. Our lives are so busy and we're inundated with so much information all the time. So that's something I always want to work on. I can always eat healthier. That would be my second one. I don't love broccoli or cauliflower or radishes. I would rather have McDonald's French fries. So always eating healthier is one for me. And just loving more in the best way that I can is just being gentle and kind and loving. I always say, I want to be a friend wants to have. I want to be a mom that my kids want to have. And that's just a daily struggle and something I can always work better at.
Wow. Well, those are 3 great ones. I appreciate the time. Thanks for coming on, Vallie.
You're welcome. Thank you. Have a good day.